Good evening. Today's talk is about John le Carre, arguably the most famous spy novelist, intelligence genre novelist in the past 50 years. And I think the reason John le Carre is extremely interesting has to do with what he said about the Cold War and after the Cold War, particularly about politics in the West. But before we go into that, perhaps why Jean le Carre became very famous in the last 40 or 50 years. I think for two or three reasons. The first is that he came after Ian Fleming, of course, the writer of and the inventor of the James Bond stories and novels, which became super world famous through the series of films. But whereas Ian Fleming presented the world of spying and intelligence and espionage very much as super glamorous, James Bond, the very charming man, the extremely gorgeous women, the wonderful places, villas, palaces, hotels, super glamorous life. John le Carre presented that world in the exact opposite, which simply was reality. So he presented the world of espionage as institutions, agencies fighting each other, not really in adventures, in glamorous places, but rather as bureaucracies thinking how to deceive the other or the others. And very much the whole thing is about gathering information in very meticulous, subtle, slow ways, analyzing them, assessing what they mean, to unlike Ian Fleming's James Bond world that has adventures and adrenaline and excitement, the world of John le Carre was about a mental struggle, a battle of brains and minds against each other. And that was not just different from Ian Fleming, but was very much a reflection of reality. Partly, largely perhaps, because Jean le Carre himself was a former intelligence officer in Britain. Actually, he wrote his first two novels while he was in British intelligence. So he knew what he's talking about. And interestingly, a number of intelligence officers actually commented in the early 80s, if I'm not mistaken, about John le Carre's novels, basically saying that he is describing what we lived through. Kim Philby, the most famous Soviet agent or mole in British intelligence, who later fled to the Soviet Union, actually more or less said that, though he joked that the plots of the novels of Jean le Carre were much more sophisticated, much more intelligent than the reality. However, it was very much a reflection of how life in that world actually is. And that sense of reality, as opposed to the entertainment that Ian Fleming provided, gave the novels of Jean le Carre sense of being for adults, for people who really want to know the reality of that world, for people who think about what happens beneath the facade and the surface of politics. The second reason why Jean le Carre's novels became very successful, in addition, of course, that he was a wonderful writer, was that he was writing about the Cold War at the height, at the midst of the Cold War. And I think this is the real point that make the work of Jean le Carre merit attention. How he described the Cold War. of course, he was Anglo-Irish, so he was British. He believed in the supremacy of a liberal democracy as opposed to communism. So there was no doubt about that. He knew where he stands and which or with which side he is. However, unlike many writers at that time, at the height of the Cold War, Jean-Luc Carre did not present Western liberal democracies as good, whilst the Soviet Union and its satellites in Eastern Europe and in the Caucasus as evil. And of course, here we remember the very famous saying by Ronald Reagan when he described the Soviet Union as the empire of evil. Jean-Luc Carre was far away from all of that. Yes, he sided, of course, with freedom for society, for the individual. So he sided with liberal democracy as an ideal. However, he very much presented in his novels the application of that ideal in the work of the institutions, of the agencies, of the entities in the liberal democracies in Britain, in the US, as full of not just problems, of acute challenges. Of course, in the same way that the institutions and entities and bureaucracies in the Soviet Union and its satellites were full of problems and challenges. The point here is that Jean-Luc Carre was mature and dealing with us as his readers as mature people who should understand that here it is not really a fight between good and evil, between good guys and bad guys. It's rather an ideological struggle between an ideology that he sides with because it embodies and it leads to freedom, and of course that is liberal democracy, as opposed to communism, though he gives credit to the great ideas upon which socialism in its early days were founded. However, he makes it very clear that the application on both sides was highly problematic. And by doing that, I think he gave his readers a subtle and also a profound, certainly real, understanding of how the Cold War was actually fought, what it really was in reality, without simplifications and without propaganda. He showed the Cold War for what it was in reality. The second reason the work of Jean-Luc Carre, I think, is extremely interesting is that by the end of the Cold War, 1990, 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, Eastern and Central Europe rushing to embrace some sort of liberal democracy, at least rushing to join the West, many people thought that's it. That's the end of the work of Jean-Luc Carre. Because he wrote about the Cold War, that was his material. However, he proved them wrong. Because I think his best novels actually came after the Cold War, in the late 90s and in the 2000s, until he died. Why? Because in that period, in the last 25, 30 years, after the end of the Cold War, what he focused upon was not the idea that the West had won, that liberal democracy is now the supreme idea, an ideal in global politics. Unlike Francis Fukuyama, he did not say, now this is the end of history. Rather, he started to pay attention to what's beneath the surface of politics within liberal democracies after the Cold War, showing that throughout the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, during the Cold War, power centers, economic and financial interests in the West were born, grew, and by the 90s have established themselves as extremely powerful, influential centers in policy making in Western liberal democracies. And that many of these power centers wanted to perpetuate some sort of a struggle after the Cold War, any kind of struggle, because struggle or struggles preserve their interests. So what he was really highlighting, shedding light on, was that yes, liberal democracy has won or did win the Cold War, but that is not the end of history. That is not that the societies of the West have now entered a panacea of wonderfulness. Rather, that there were so many power interests that grew in the Cold War that are now perpetuating struggles that many of the institutions that had fought the Cold War are now engaged in perpetuating these struggles for their own interests as opposed to the interests of the societies in the West. So basically, he, post the Cold War, didn't really change his subject matter, but rather widened it. So the struggles that he was now elaborating on were not ideological between liberal democracy and communism, between the East and the West. Rather, how the consequences of the struggle that was the Cold War evolved into different forms of struggle within the liberal democracies themselves, and that within these struggles there are conflicts of interests between power centers that grew during the Cold War and wanted the preservation of the notion of struggle as opposed to the masses of the people in the societies that did not really want a struggle, that actually thought the end of the Cold War should result in some sort of prosperity, some sort of global peace. I think his portrayal of politics in the West in the last 20-25 years after the end of the Cold War again gives his readers a subtle, profound, and very intelligent way of looking at the consequences of the Cold War on or in liberal democracies. Together, his work on the Cold War and post the Cold War make Jean-Le Carre, in my view, not just a wonderful novelist with very exciting, intelligent novels that show the reality of the world of espionage, but also gives us an in-depth, smart understanding of politics in the last 50 years during and post the Cold War.